What went wrong with this plan? Well, we see what went wrong in a letter from Secretary of State Marshall in 1947. Syria had, and President Quwatli had asked America to send a military mission to take in hand the resurrection of the Syrian army and to train it and to arm it and to do everything. America had the means, Syria had the need. But by 47, and of course Quwatli didn't trust his army. It had been stacked with all these minorities, Alawites, Armenians, Druze, everything that the French had stuck in there, people who would shoot at the Sunni nationalists and keep them down on the farm. So Quwatli needed the American cover to rebuild his army. The Americans wanted to do it. 47, you get a letter from Secretary of State Marshall says, tell the Syrians we can't do it and we shouldn't waste any more time on this. Congress will never support a military mission because there's going to be a war in Palestine and we're not going to support Syria. So that's the end of that, and Syria gets left. Within days, you can see the Syrians have turned and said, we've got to go to the Soviet Union for our arms. Aslan, who wants to be, Adil Aslan, who wants to be defense minister, writes in his diaries, I told Quwatli, we've got to go to the Soviet Union because we're not going to get arms from the West. They're going to screw us. They're going to side with the Jews. Now, Quwatli wouldn't do that because the landed elite in Syria, the Sunni elite in Syria, wanted to be Western. They wanted to be capitalist. They didn't want to go to the Soviet Union, where Akram Hourani, the Ba'ath Party, and all these other little guys were saying, we're going to go to the Soviet Union. So they resisted getting arms, and they didn't get arms. And they failed miserably in the war, and they got beaten up. And in a sense, America pulled the rug out from underneath the Sunni landed merchant elite of Syria that would have been pro-Western because it wanted to support the Jews in Palestine. And it refused to support Israel. I mean, it refused to support Syrians. Now, and of course, it made trouble for itself by supporting coup d'etats in Syria. The first one, of course, is 49. It supported the chief of staff, or at least it didn't take a big active role, but it supported the chief of staff, Hosni Zain, to take power because he promised America, I will restart the oil pipeline that goes through. I will make peace with Israel. I will settle 400,000 Palestinians in the Jazeera and solve your Palestinian problem by making Palestinians into Syrians. This was what America wanted to hear, and I'll arrest a lot of communists. That was the sort of icing on top of the cake. And Americans said, fine, this sounds great. And they negotiated for the next 5 years to spend $500 million if they could settle those Palestinians up the Euphrates. And they would give $1 for every settled, every dollar they gave for Palestinians, they give $1 for Syria to develop. But it was all based about Palestinians and Israel. This is all about Israel and solving the Israeli problem. They couldn't do it. The Syrians could, nobody could take that money to turn Palestinians into Syrians. And Akram Hourani and the Ba'ath Party won. They carried out the revolution. They got rid of the Sunnis, who would have been pro-Western, and they took over and they became very pro-Soviet. And bad relations have been cemented ever since. And then, of course, 67, rise of Nasserism, so forth. The Golan Heights gets lost. Israel takes it. And that becomes, the Golan becomes the issue for Syria ever since. It is the issue. Now, there's a lot of people in Washington who will say it's not about the Golan. Syria doesn't want the Golan. It's got, the Alawite regime can only have war. It doesn't want peace. Why? Because they're Alawites. They're frightened of the Sunnis who want war and not peace. I don't understand this argument. It's a foolish argument. It's not true. Now, how can I convince you it's not true? It's all about the Golan. What Assad says is true. I think he's actually saying what he means in this instance. Look at Syria's friends. Syria's friends are Iran, are Hezbollah, are Hamas. They are Turkey, now that Turkey is switching away from Israel to the east. Who are Syria's enemies? Everybody who has allied in order to hurt this alliance. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and anybody else who joins in with America, Israel, who have allied together in order to hurt Iran, Syria, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth. The Middle East is divided along those lines. And for Syria, it's all about the Golan. Its allies are people who will help it get back to Golan. Its enemies are those who are trying to undermine its efforts to get back to Golan. It's not complicated. And that's because Golan is actually important for Syria. And Syria sacrificed economic development and many other things because of the Golan issue. It's the one issue that all Syrians agree on. Okay. Let us look at some of these WikiLeaks. Golan is our issue. President Bashar al-Assad explains January 2010 in a confidential dispatch. He's talking to a whole bunch of visiting American dignitaries. He describes Hamas as an uninvited guest in his country and suggests that he would be willing to give up his alliance if Syria could sign peace with Israel that would return the whole of the Golan. Assad promises that U.S. officials that Syria is ready to change its relationship to Hamas and to Hezbollah if it gets back the Golan. Change, not cut, not end, not do this, but it can stop supplying weapons. And all of Iran's weapons, most of them, come through Syria to Hezbollah. Syria needs Hezbollah for two things. One is to put pressure, the most important is to put pressure on Israel. But two is to arrange domestic affairs within Lebanon. For number one, putting pressure on Israel, Hezbollah has to be an armed militia. For number two, it doesn't. It just has to be a populist party, which it happens to be anyway. So it doesn't need the military support in order to still play an important role for Syria. I'm not suggesting that Syria would ever give up role number two, but it can modify role number one. And arms that go to Hezbollah overseas or through the air get stopped by Israel. And we've seen that just yesterday when Israel stopped the ship 200 miles off its coast from Iran and said that crate of weapons is going to Hamas. We're stopping this boat. Now, Syria has influence over Hezbollah and is willing to alter that situation for peace. That's what Assad says. Now, you can disbelieve it, but he says it. And he says it every single time there's an American who comes to talk to him in Damascus. And we can see that in the WikiLeaks. Every one of them has the same thing. In his interview with the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago, he goes, the interviewer says, what about Syria's link to Hezbollah? He's going to push him on the Hezbollah question. And Assad says, look, why does the United States always want to talk about subtitles? It should talk about the title. And he goes into this big thing about titles and subtitles. But what he's saying is, the title of this book is Peace. Don't talk to me. He says, we can follow a cherry-picking approach. Once we talk about Hezbollah, once we talk about Hamas, if you talk about armaments or smuggling arms and all these little subsidiary questions, we are going to get nowhere, he says, because these are things that are all present because of the lack of peace. As long as you do not have peace, you will have everything you do not like, he says. We're going to support Hamas and Hezbollah. Why wouldn't we? We've got to get back to Golan. If we don't support these guys, Israel will never even look at us. They don't take us seriously today, but they certainly won't take us seriously if we don't support their enemies.